All right, so that should be us started. Can I just double check that everybody can see the slides okay, just before I get started?
All
Hello,
good?
everybody. Can everyone see us? Say hello. I can see your slides, Nicole.
Perfect. All right, so I'm just going to get started. Tonight's webinar is focused on wired versus wireless. All right, and this is focused towards the transmission methods on how we communicate. Okay, so firstly, I would like to introduce both Andrew and Elizabeth, if you want to give a short introduction each.
So good evening, everyone. My name's Elizabeth, and you may have seen me in some of the introduction webinars before. I work at Cisco, and I'm leading the Cisco Networking Academy program in the UK and Ireland. So great to see you all.
And I don't think Andrew's with us this evening, but he would help with the support and works for the Open University. Okay, so just a quick introduction. My name's Nicole. I am a higher education lecturer, mainly focused towards cybersecurity, and I work in the Manchester area.
And hi,
Then Rebecca.
I'm Rebecca Harrop. I'm a senior lecturer in cybersecurity at the University of Bedfordshire, and also work with networking and quite a lot of the Cisco Network Academy courses at both the Open University and other places. So hello and welcome this evening.
Okay, so first thing that we're going to look at is wired versus wireless. So firstly, what actually is wired? And that's really looking at the physical connection, the physical wiring between different devices. It's most often used in home offices and large offices. And it's really devices that can't, whenever devices are connected via wireless, they're not as easily moved around. So those devices are going to be static and they're going to stay in that same location usually. Wireless then, it's a connection using your radio waves, and that carries the signals. It usually is a shorter range, and it can be impacted by different obstacles as well, physical obstacles, that may impact the strength of the signals. Okay, so the first thing that we are going to do is a quick task. All right, so have a think. What would be fastest? Would it be wired? Would it be wireless? What would be most reliable? Wired or wireless? What would be easier to configure? So that's a setup. If there's any amendments to be made, what is easier to make those changes and the upgrades, and which type would be more secure? So if I give you a couple of minutes to do that.
So it's audience participation time. So you type in the chat this time, and you'll help us to actually fill in the table and get thinking. You do kind of know this if you think about your own networks at home, which probably have both, right? So you possibly have wired and wireless connections in your own home. If you wanted a reliable connection, would you be better off plugging your PC in, or would you just keep it doing wireless? Or which you wanted a faster connection, what would you do? Would you keep it using wireless, or would you, if you were sitting right next to the router and you had the option to be able to have a wire coming out of the router rather than going wirelessly, which would you choose? So let's do fastest first. Which one's faster, wired or wireless? What do you think? Type in the box. Actually, we'll work out which way around the box is for you. It might be that way. It depends on how many people we've got, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, I can't actually see the chat because I have my screen shared just to...
Okay, so at least one's going wired. There we go. There's a couple going wired. And I think, I think you're absolutely right. Does anyone for like bonus points know actually how fast wired is compared to wireless? And how about most reliable? Is that the same or different? Nicole already gave you a clue. What do you think for most reliable? It may be the same two people answering. So again, we've got a vote for wired for most reliable as well. It can quite often depend on the distance from the router, can't it? If those of you who've got like consoles that require a download for a game, there's nothing that proves this point to you more the speed and the reliability more than a child waiting for a game to download onto a console wirelessly. And eventually you think, do you know what, I'm gonna move this device closer to my actual router or hub so that it actually downloads faster for them. So I think you're right. I think it's most wired is definitely more reliable. There's lots of things that we'll discuss in a minute that can do with that. How about easiest to configure? Add more users, get a device online with it. Which one is easier there? Requires less technical expertise to set up, perhaps. Okay, so now finally we've got some votes for wireless. Okay, so we're mainly going wireless here, aren't we? And I think that's probably true. It depends though, doesn't it? It might once a wired network is I think you're absolutely right. For adding ad hoc users to a wireless network, definitely easier. You effectively just the wireless network, all you have to do is potentially put in the SSID, which we'll talk about, the service set identifier of the wireless network. You have to say, I'm going to connect to this network, whatever it might be called, and then you put in the hopefully it's encrypted, or hopefully you have an authentication and you have to log into it using some sort of authentication and put in some sort of password. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's it, then you're on, right? And you can keep adding devices to it. So you get a new tablet, you get a new mobile phone, you get something else. Somebody comes to your house and they can log onto your network using the same username and password if you have a shared passcode. With a wired network, you have to physically find them a port and a socket, and they have to sit down, and it has to be somewhere where it's already configured, right? Although to a certain degree, if it's already installed and in place, then hopefully there's just literally a socket on the table and that's already been thought about. But I think you're right. I think wireless on the whole is easier. More secure, $1 million question. Which one do you think is more secure, wired or wireless, inherently by its very nature? So you're going wired this time again. Okay, here's the $1 million question. Why? What makes wired networks inherently more secure than wireless? Or what makes a wireless network inherently less secure than a wired network? Can you justify why? There's a number of reasons, but there's one that's more obvious than others. This is where everyone's going to pause for a while to type a complicated answer into the box, and that's fine. Because it's nice. Well, there is less interference by stuff like walls and with wired. You're absolutely right. So that would be more of a reliability thing. That would be more of a reliability thing. But good to hear from you, Mantra, that you have to physically access the wired one. So you have to actually be in the building and with physical access to the wired network, as opposed to on a wireless network, the signal is effectively in the air. So it's what's called a blurred network edge. Companies and larger organizations, and to a certain extent your own home, have to be quite careful about where the signal can actually be picked up outside of the building or outside of the secure areas, because you could literally drive a truck up to the outside of it and be able to pick up the network. So if that wasn't carefully authenticated, if you weren't careful about how you connected to that network in the first place, if for example you did something like had a shared encryption, or if you think about the Costa coffee shop for a second, where you all know the password, right? It's like stuck on the wall and it says hotels, yeah, or what you call a public hotspot, you know what the username and password is to log onto the network, then that's it, isn't it, right? You can just get onto it. So similarly, though, when everyone shares a password, so this is, it doesn't matter which encryption it is, and you'd normally want to use something called WPA2 or WPA3 because they're more secure. So this is to log on to the network now, and you'll have seen those come up with your wireless network questions when you log in and authenticate. But if they share it's called PSK, if they share a passcode with one another, so if everybody has the same password, then you need to be quite careful about that, because what a cyber attacker could do is they could affect, even if they didn't know what that password was, they could drive up to your network edge, and then they could send out what's called a de-authentication frame, and they throw everybody off your wireless network, knowing that then the next thing everyone's going to do is try to log back onto it again. And they packet sniff or then listen to that transaction happen, and they can take that away with them, and they can try to brute force crack that password and work out what that password is. Does anyone know what the solution then with public Wi-Fi networks is? It is in your skills for all somewhere, and it's quite an important concept. If you're ever unsure about the safety of a wireless network, what should you be turning on your PC in order to make sure that your data at least is always encrypted when it's going back and forth between your computer and the access point? Yeah, so you need a virtual private network or a VPN turned on. Thank you for helping. That was good. I'll show you the, so we covered that very, very well. It's wired is fastest for sure is, and there's two reasons. Number one, it is faster. You can get 10 gigabits per second, and that's a proper throughput, really, to be completely honest. The second thing is that that's normally one cable going from your router, or from, well, it would be from a switch. Like when we did that packet tracer activity last week, it's one connection going from that switch into the host. So it's a direct connection, right? It's not a shared bandwidth. Whereas actually on Wi-Fi 5 and 6, they're now called 5 and 6, by the way, and not 802.11 AC and AX, because, you know, it's easier to remember. But this is the advertised potential best bandwidth. And what you actually see is, so like potentially Wi-Fi 6, although most of us are still on Wi-Fi 5, is like 9 gigabytes per second and 10 gigabits per second. But you get realistically more like 1. And here's the second thing, it's a shared bandwidth. So inside your home, if you were perhaps, I don't know, forget getting it from the internet for a minute, because that's even slower than that. But inside your home, if you were streaming music from a computer upstairs, or a video or something from a computer upstairs through your house, you would be sharing that information between, or sharing that bandwidth between all the devices that were trying to do it. So it's much faster on wired, significantly. And yeah, much more reliable. Those of us who live in the good old Victorian semi-detached houses that are all over the UK, and they have really, really fantastic thick walls, which is great for insulation and for the state of the house, and absolutely appalling when you want to be in that top bedroom and have your wireless network. And so traditionally you have to have some sort of repeater, or you signal booster upstairs. And yeah, you were not wrong with easier to configure, and I think we discussed that. There's usually less complex configuration. And wired is typically more secure, because otherwise you have to worry about wireless networks. They've got this blurred network edge, and you have to be careful about how you authenticate onto the network, on who can get access to that. And yes, use a VPN. So a VPN, good question. So a VPN, if you imagine, usually you would use it, typically VPNs were brought about when people started doing remote working. So what they do is they set up between the host computer and the other end, they set up a secure encrypted channel that the information will get sent between. So if I'm sitting in Costa Coffee Shop and I'm my computer's sending information up to the access point or the router in the Costa coffee shop, then what it's doing is it's setting up a secure, and that I might be then connected to my place of work, right? On the other side of that, I might be sending quite confidential information. What it does is it completely encrypts it. So I've logged onto, or I've authenticated onto the Wi-Fi network at Costa Coffee Shop with a shared password that everybody knows. So somebody next to me could be using something that packet sniffs or eavesdrops that signal and be listening to my communication between my computer and the access point. But if I use a VPN, it encrypts that communication. WhatsApp, you're familiar with it with WhatsApp. When you talk about WhatsApp communications, it's encrypted from end to end, which means if somebody's in the middle, if somebody intercepts that message in the middle, it looks like nonsense to them. And it should be a fairly decent encryption, so it would be difficult for them to reverse engineer it and unencrypt it. So it takes your data and encrypts it. It also does a little bit more of the job than that. It works as a proxy server, but don't worry about that. It keeps it secure.
Okay, so moving on then and just having a quick look at wired networks, and having a quick look, the first three, so can you see my mouse just over the top or not?
No.
Maybe
Oh,
not.
yes, we can.
You can. Perfect. All right, so the first cable is your unshielded twisted pair. Then the second one across is your shielded twisted pair. Third one is your coaxial cable, and then the fourth is your fiber optic cable. All right, and really your Ethernet was created, and it was really to standardize the cables that are used and the connectors that should be used. And I'm sure you've probably heard of your RJ45 connectors, usually used within your Ethernet cables. But it was a standard that was set to ensure that all computer network equipment did use the same cables, and it allowed the transmission to be similar. Initially, the main use for Ethernet would have been your coaxial cable. All right, so this one here, and today it's still mainly used for your aerial for your television. So some of you may have came across that one before. However, with your Ethernet, it does have several different categories. And that's really just to guarantee the transmission speed that is occurring. So I know both myself and Rebecca mentioned about the transmission speed being up to about 10 gigabits per second, and that would be mainly with your category 7. The two main categories used would be your category 5, which would be a transmission speed of about 100 megabits per second, and then your category 6, which is about 1 gigabits per second. And they both use your twisted pair type cables. All right, and then your fiber optic, or just before I move on to fiber optic, with your with your Ethernet cables, they mainly use electrical pulses to send the data down the network. And then moving on to your fiber optic, they would use light pulses to send the transmission. They are made up of either glass or plastic strands, and then they do transfer the data using light, which is then transmitted along the fiber optic network using a laser. With your fiber optic, they are quite good in harsh environments as well. And really, I know we have previously already touched on this, but the main benefits of your wired network would be your reliability, because they're less prone to the likes of interference, whereas your wireless networks would be. Your speed, again, stronger speeds, the data security as well, because there's less opportunities for sniffing the traffic as well. Moving on then to wireless. Rebecca, do you want to take over at this stage, or?
Sure, I can do. Yeah, I think you guys possibly just as familiar with wireless flavors as much as we are. it's everywhere really, isn't it? It's in quite a lot of our sort of portable devices, and that is its main reason, or its main advantage over wired, is of course that we have portability. I'm sitting here using a laptop, even though I know that actually pound for pound I'm going to get less power out of a laptop than I will out of a desktop, but purely so that I can take it downstairs or I can move around my house with it. And we have a lot of wireless technologies that have come our way that have become second nature to us using. So NFC and RFID, quite often used for now our payments, our touch payments with our phones, or with indeed with a card of some nature. When we go into the gym, we might have a card that opens up the gate for us, or that reads at a door. That's very, very short range, right? So you need to be quite on top of things. RFID is a little bit of a longer range than NFC. RFID doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like chip and pin or either. It normally looks like the little codes, the little square thing that you get quite often in the back of you get them quite often in your packages. So it's used in logistics. So when you're tracking a parcel, they have it in the back of a package, or you still use for security in purchases. So in a shop, you might have an RFID tag in the actual expensive item that actually, and they're inside those tags that they take off, the security tags that they take off in the shop. And then if you leave it on, it sets the beeping alarm off when you try to leave the store with the item still in your possession with the tag on it, right? Bluetooth devices, I think we're sort of fairly familiar with. You've got Bluetooth on your phone that connects to stuff, and all of your Fitbits and the rest and the like of it can communicate with Bluetooth. Again, a slightly longer distance. So we try to put them in distance order here. Then we're very familiar with Wi-Fi technologies and using Wi-Fi in the home. You also have, if you've got smart things and Internet of Things, you might have stuff that's on what's we'd use Zigbee or Z-Wave for those. Don't worry about too much about this. You don't need to know this level of detail for the content that you're doing. I'm just filling in the gaps. But we're quite used to Wi-Fi. And then eventually you also have something so in this diagram, you also then have cellular. On the diagram that we're seeing now, I've sort of showing you that typically as the range increases, you get, so Wi-Fi is more capable of better data rates than most of the sort of NFCs and RFID stuff. But in particular, so then the cellular technologies. One of the problems you've got with cellular technologies, although it's becoming better, is what's called latency. So sometimes you can't use cellular technologies for things like real-time applications. So until recently, it was very difficult to do something like, wireless surgery, where somebody was controlling a robot to do a surgery over cellular technology, because if there was a small lag or a small latency between what you were seeing on the camera and what the actual surgery was doing, that could obviously be, catastrophic. But those latencies are getting much, much better, and cellular technologies are now capable of doing real-time technologies. The one you'll probably never hear mentioned, unless you go off to do many more courses, is LPWAN, or low-powered wide area network technologies. But they're the things that really are taking over, that in things like in industrial control systems and in like farmers' fields, and because they can have a very, very tiny amounts of data can be sent. So it'll be like a sensor that tells the farmer if it's raining, or whether or not it's daylight or not in a field or something. But it can go for a very, very long distance, and it hardly uses any battery power. So quite a lot of these technologies with Wi-Fi, and you'll find this out with most of your portable devices, right? Is if you leave Bluetooth on, it drains your battery. Yeah, so quite a lot of them are quite battery hungry, whereas the LPWAN stuff, so that's something called LoRa. You might and don't worry about these, but they have very, very little drain on a battery. So I thought that might be interesting for you to see a bigger picture with the wireless flavors. A lot of them suffer from the same kind of security aspects, because they are using radio waves, because they're using frequencies that are traveling through the air, albeit on different frequencies. What you have to think about is, how is that signal being sent, and what happens if that signal is captured. Now, this has been around for a long, long time, this problem. And interestingly enough, if you want to know about your girls in tech, It was even Hedy Lamarr who wrote one of the earliest papers on wireless security. And do look her up. She's absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And as well as being a phenomenal woman, she was also a pioneer in wireless technologies. And she talked about authentication problems with this, and she talked about encryption issues in wireless technologies very, very early on. So usually the solution, and we go back to our cybersecurity pillars again. So if you want to try and solve a confidentiality problem, if you want to solve a problem about confidentiality, then the solution is usually encryption. So if you are sending signals between wireless devices, what you typically do is you just encrypt it. And as providing you're encrypting the two signals that are going back to back with one another, then as providing that encryption's a significantly higher standard. We don't need to go into the details about how that's achieved right now, but if it's complicated enough, then usually what that means is it's difficult to break it. And so therefore it becomes more safe. But you do have to bear in mind whenever you do that there is that compromise to be made. There are other problems with wireless technologies. So you do need to use encryption. And when we're using, you need to be using something called WPA2 and WPA3 as a minimum. We did used to have WEP or WEP a long time ago, and that's crackable in a heartbeat. So when you're logging onto a Wi-Fi network, you would always be looking for it to be WPA2 or WPA3 when you're actually logging onto it in the first instance. If you're using the personal version, which all of us are at home on our home networks, we will be using a common passphrase. It's really securely stuck on a sticker on the bottom of your router that tells everybody who comes into your house what your Wi-Fi password is, right? And we'll get back to that. What you should also be doing is changing stuff from the defaults if you possibly can too. But it's a shared passcode. So we have the same problem that we did before, in that either if I've displayed that password or everybody knows that password, like the person who's come into my house before now knows my Wi-Fi password, right? Or if I've visited a network before, I now know the Wi-Fi password. The other problem is I only have to brute force or crack one password and I'm in. You have something called WPA2 or WPA3 Enterprise, which is a bit more complicated. It might be that you like the username and logins that you have at work. This is on, without getting too complicated, it uses a wired technology. It uses a similar protocol, and it authenticates with both a username and a separate password for you. So it's unique to you as an individual. So it does a better check. Use a VPN whenever possible if you're in any doubt about the wireless network. And then the one that we don't do is we're quite used to not. I don't know how many of you would ever purge your networks. If you go and look through your wired networks on your device, your wireless networks on your devices, like the number of wireless networks you've ever connected to, do we ever get rid of them? Like, you know, and you might go, if you go through your lists, we might find a hotel we were once in or something of that nature. And that could be quite bad. So occasionally we have to purge them and get rid of them. I'm going to stop talking now because we're getting quite close to time. But you look out for what's called evil twins or rogue access points. That's like there's someone pretending to be Gatwick Airport's access point. And it's the same problem. So if you're ever in doubt, you have to be careful of public networks and be careful that you're connecting to a real and trusted one. And then last but not least, and it's the same for wired or wireless, if you segment things and you actually just make your networks be in separate areas. So if I keep my wireless network on a different set of IP addresses than the wired network, then even if somebody compromised my wireless network, they shouldn't be able to leak to the other. Right. I will pass back to Nicole to say goodbye to us all.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. All right, bye-bye.
We're pretty much on time, aren't we?
Yeah, that's the webinar stop now.
No, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, done.
Sorry, did I keep talking for too long? Got to pay attention to the time.
You were grand. I know.
I think that people were quite engaged though, even though there wasn't loads on. And as Andrew said, obviously this is like the first, go, and in January we're probably going to ramp it up a bit and try and encourage people to join live. But for the people that are joining, like they were they were engaged, getting less nervous.
Yeah, I'm glad we didn't do it as a whiteboard though.
It can be really chaotic also because people try and hijack it. Like I've had it before when we were doing like a career day, we had like 200, 300 people in, and people kept trying to do it. And then when you hijack the whiteboard, you like hijack the whole sharing permissions and it just caused chaos. So yeah, I guess maybe another tool like Miro or something could be a good way of doing it. But
I do whiteboard stuff with my online classes all the time, but I guess there might be a little bit more. They're less anonymous, aren't they, when they're your daytime classes, because you know who they are. So they
maybe if it's more people in the future.
Yeah, I know with whenever you're sharing as well, it's pretty hard to obviously monitor both because you can't get back to the chat. But you do get notifications to say what's coming up, but it's a bit
Oh, can
awkward
you
that
see
way.
the chat at all then?
So
Does it keep interrupting you?
So it just pops up. You don't actually, you're not really able to follow it or anything. So if there was maybe a couple of messages at once, I wouldn't be able to follow that if you were sharing.
Oh, so me trying to say things that supplemented what you're talking about at the time is probably really intrusive, isn't it? Sorry.
No, you're fine. But I just mean for like say if somebody was to do a webinar on their own and had nobody as backup to kind of support the chat, it would be a wee bit more difficult. No, it'd help.
Yeah, they did ask questions this time though, didn't they? Or at least one.
Yeah. It's good.
Okay. Sorry if I spoke too much.
I don't think I have to stop the recording or anything, do I?
We should just go to Andrew, I think, when we leave the meeting.
So, okay, perfect.
Because he's the one that set it up. I think it goes to his account.
Yeah.
At least we hope.
We hope so.
So don't panic if you don't get anything, because I think it goes to him once we leave.
That's grand.
Thanks again, Nicole.
All right.
No worries, thank you. All right, chat to you later.
Have a good evening.
You too, bye-bye.
Bye, ladies.